are listening to Hold Fast, a podcast where we have biblical truths for daily battles. My name is Kenny. I'm the host of the podcast, and I am a little bit late getting this podcast episode out this week, which is perfect because I was a little bit busy earlier in the week when I normally record the podcast, and that's exactly what I want to talk about on this episode. I want to talk about handling busyness. I want to talk about one of the number one things that people talk to me about as a pastor when we have conversations about serving at church, or we have conversations about the personal devotions and spiritual disciplines. A lot of times people, and myself included, will immediately bring up how busy we are. When you ask someone, how are you doing? I mean, one of the most common answers that I get, and one of the most common answers that I seem to be giving other people in my life is, I'm busy. Things are pretty good. I'm just busy, And I think that there's a lot to that. I mean, it sort of is almost the default answer these days. And some of that has to do with the fact that I think we view busyness as almost a measure of success. Like if I'm busy, if I have a lot to do, it means that I have a lot of responsibility. It means that I'm maybe successful at my job because I'm busy at work, or I have a family and all these obligations and responsibilities. And sure, I wish maybe I wasn't as busy, but this tells me that I must be doing something right. We almost see busyness as a badge of honor. And we may not say it that way, but I do think that's how we can tend to view it sometimes. But if you were to get honest with people, you would find that most people don't really want to be busy. They wish they were better at prioritizing their life. And a conversation that I've actually had with several people over the last few weeks is, how do I do that? How do I actually prioritize my life? When I talk with especially Christian men, they will talk about how it's really difficult to balance their relationship with Christ and their family and their job. And then especially if they're also then serving at church, how do I do all of these things? Because I know that first and foremost, I'm a follower of Christ. And then secondly, I am a husband and then a father. And then for me, I'm a pastor. So how do I prioritize that? I know those are the priorities, but how does that actually flesh itself out in my calendar? And I think we've all had seasons of being overwhelmed. I mean, no matter your responsibility, no matter what your life is, I believe we've probably all had times in our lives where we would say, there's too much going on. I am too overwhelmed. I'm too busy. And that does happen. And I don't want you to feel guilty about that. But I do want to say something that I heard years ago that has always stuck with me. And it goes something like this. If you have been busy, if you've been in that state of being overwhelmingly busy for more than like a few months, then it's probably not a season. It very likely has now become a lifestyle. And you need to not just make changes for that season, but you need to make lifestyle changes. And that's not the main point of the episode today, but I think that's something I do want to say at the outset is if you're listening to this and you're saying, man, I have been feeling this overwhelming busyness for a long time, then don't call it a season. You need to figure out and address what's going on fundamentally in the way you structure your life and the way you organize your days that needs to change, because that's no longer a season if it's been going on for quite some time. Inevitably, what happens when we get busy is the things that are most important get pushed out. And for most of us, again, myself included, I am preaching to the choir here, if I can use that statement. This is not something that I have mastered. It is something that by God's grace, I do think I have gotten better at over the years. And I have times where I'm doing well and times where I'm struggling with it. But I do think overall I have got better at it over the years. But when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm busy, what tends to be the first thing to get pushed out is my quiet time with the Lord, my time in His Word, my time spent really praying to Him. Those things tend to get pushed out. And I think that needs to not be the case, obviously. I think that we need to be better at prioritizing our life in such a way that when we get busy, the most important things are not the first things to get crowded out of our lives. We've got to learn to structure our lives in such a way that whether we're busy or we're not, the most important things go first. You've likely seen somebody do the illustration of this glass container where if you put in sand in the container first, and then you put little rocks, and then you try to fit big rocks in, you're not going to have any room for the big rocks. But if you put the big rocks, the most important things, first inside the container and fill that with the big rocks, then the sand and the little rocks can fall in and fill in the crevices. And I do think that's a good illustration. I'm not one to use props in my preaching or podcast, but if you can picture that, I think that's a good illustration of what it is that we need to do. There's a question that I heard years ago, and I'm probably not repeating it word for word. Over the years, I've adapted it maybe into my own language that's memorable for me. And I don't even honestly remember where I heard it from. It probably was several sources. But there's a question that I have learned over the years to ask myself. And it's the question I want to focus on the rest of this podcast episode. It's a question that you can ask that I believe if you honestly answer it, if you answer it with an open calendar in front of you, and we'll talk about that, I think it will begin to help you have the right principles and discipline to manage the busyness and manage life even when it's not busy. And here's the question. How do I be most faithful to what matters most right now? Let me say that again, because I think pretty much every word in that statement or that question is important. How do I be most faithful to what matters most right now? That is a very different question than how do I do it all? Or how do I get out of this busy season of life? Or how do I manage it? How do I balance everything? This is a much better question. How do I be most faithful to what matters most right now? I believe this is a biblical principle. I believe it can be found in a few places. Maybe one of the most clear places is in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. Paul says, "Look carefully then how you walk. Be intentional with how you live your life. Don't just let life happen to you. Don't just wing it." And that was my motto for most of my life. And I can tend to fall into that pattern often if I'm not careful. So look carefully how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, according to godly wisdom. And here's the principle: making the most or the best use of the time, because the days are evil. How do I make the best use of the time in these evil days? Well, I need to seek to be faithful. God's not called us ultimately to success as defined by worldly standards. He's called us to faithfulness. So you're not asking, how do I do it all? You're not asking, how do I find success in every single avenue of my life? You're asking, how do I be most faithful by God's grace? I would probably add that in there's probably a good addition to the question. How do I, by God's grace, be most faithful to what matters most right now? I've said already, what tends to get crowded out when life becomes busy, and sometimes even when it's not, is our quiet time, our time in the Word. And we would say that's a top priority, but it tends to go away when life gets a little bit busier than normal. Our quality time with our families may go away. You may struggle with, wanting to be at the dinner table with your family every night, but finding that your life has gotten so busy that you don't even have time for that anymore, and you barely see your family. You might be in that season of life. But you know what often doesn't go away? At least for me. Listen, I might not be speaking to you, but I know I'm speaking to myself right now. What tends to not go away when life gets busy is my time on social media. Matter of fact, and this thought just hit me, so it's kind of convicting in the moment for me. I think if there were a way, because you can track your screen time, right? You can track how much time you spend on your phones, and that's convicting enough. I think if there were a way to connect those screen time statistics to my calendar and my schedule, I'm willing to bet that in my life, and I'm guessing this is true for at least some of you too, the busier my life gets, the more screen time I have. Because I tend to use screen time as like an escape. It's like it is a way to check out. It's a way to just kind of mindlessly scroll and not have to face a responsibility, not have to deal with the thing that's in front of me. And so that's the thing that doesn't get crowded out for me. When life is busy and chaotic, I don't lose time on social media. I tend to gain time on social media. Not always. I mean, sometimes life is so crazy that I don't even have time to pick up my phone. And that's a whole nother podcast episode, maybe, because I think that can be unhealthy, especially if it's for more than a very short stretch of time. But how do we ensure this doesn't happen? How do we make sure that, busy or not, we have control of our lives in a godly way? How do we make the best use of our time? How do we be most faithful to what matters most right now? There's a couple practical things that I have learned from other people. Specifically, there is a pastor who has been a mentor to me, has been a faithful friend to me, who has helped me think through these things. He had me, and I'm going to ask you to consider doing this as well. he had me literally write out, he calls them vocations. Write out your vocations. What are your vocations? Your callings, your responsibilities, your roles, whatever word you want to use. And I have it on my computer in an app that I use that I actually call it my vocations. And I have them listed out in order of priority. So I am a Christ follower first, then I'm a father, then I'm a husband, then I'm a father, and then I am a preacher and pastor, and the list goes on. I'm not going to share the entire list with you because I don't want to have to walk through and explain why I have the priorities the way they are in my own personal life. I don't have time for that in this podcast episode. But think about your life. Think about your roles, whether you are a son or a mother or a friend or a coworker or a boss, or what are your roles that fit into these categories? List them out biblically by order of priority. What is most important? Now that's step one. And I think many of us have done that mentally. You might not have that list written out, but you could probably rattle off what that list is right now. And if you can't, this is a good exercise. Think about it and write it out. But then under each one, within each one of those things, so first as a Christ follower, what does an ideal week look like for me to be faithful as a Christ follower? If I'm not overwhelmingly busy, if I have managed my time and my schedule well, what does an ideal week as a Christ follower look like for me? How much time am I spending in God's word? When am I spending time in God's word? How much time am I spending in prayer? When am I spending time in prayer? What are the spiritual disciplines I'm working on right now? And how am I working on them? And when am I working on them? As a husband, what does a faithful week as a husband look like? And put specifics in there. And those specifics, by the way, might change by the season. Because when I was a husband to my wife, when we had babies in the house, it looks a little bit different now that we have an older toddler. Maybe you can say Cam is. I don't know what that classification is. And a 7-year-old. Now that I have a 4 to 7-year-old, it looks a little bit different to be faithful to my wife, and certainly to be faithful as a father to a 4 and a 7-year-old than it did when they were babies. So these things can change over time. But be specific. Write down what an ideal week looks like. And then here's what happens. Let's say you are looking at the week ahead, and that's a crucial thing, by the way. You should actually look at the week ahead before the week begins, and you should ask the question, how do I be most faithful to what matters most right now this week? As I look at my calendar, am I setting myself up to be most faithful to what matters most? So this past week is actually a very good example in my own life and how this pans out and how this plays out. I had scheduled months ago to be a part of 2 different pastor gatherings this week. One of them was a gathering at First Baptist downtown, and another one was at Trinity Baptist Church, but both of them were essentially pastors' gatherings. I enjoy doing that. I think it's good for me to spend time with other pastors from time to time. I don't want to pastor alone. But what happened is when I scheduled those things, I didn't realize my family would be moving to a new house closer to the church. I didn't realize certain things would be going on in my schedule that I would say are more important than gathering with other pastors. Not that gathering with other pastors is not important. I think it's very important. I think it's something that I should try to prioritize when I can, but it does not take priority over my family. And I realized this week, if I committed to those things, then it was going to mean I had less time for my daily job, which means my daily job was then going to have to eat into my family time. And I realized in order to be most faithful to what matters most this week, I needed to say no to those things. Now, my family doesn't even have to know that I had that scheduled and I canceled that. But I promise you, they would have felt the results if I did not cancel those things, because my work time would have eaten into my family time. I would have had to be at work longer. I would have maybe had to do things at night. And I realized that wasn't going to work. Now, sometimes you make commitments and obligations that you can't get out of. I get that. But look at your week and look at your vocations and say, based on what I believe is most important, how do I be most faithful to those things this week? Look at the bigger picture. How do I organize my life? So you should look at your calendar over the past 3 months and maybe look at the next 3 months as well. And big picture, 30,000 foot view, ask yourself, based on the way that I'm organizing my life, am I setting myself up to be most faithful to what matters most? Or are the most faithful things getting crowded out by things that are urgent, but not more important? Maybe even things that are important, but they're not more important than what matters most. And this is not some kind of perfect tie it up with a bow system, like if you do this, you'll never feel overwhelmed and everything will go perfectly. Listen, life happens. Unexpected things happen. Obligations come into play. You might have a very demanding job that makes this difficult. I believe one of the blessings of serving in ministry is that it can be flexible at times. Yes, it's demanding. Yes, it can be consuming in your schedule, but there's some flexibility with that. You may not have that, so you've got to get a little bit more creative than maybe I'm getting in certain areas. But be intentional. That's really the main point with this. Be intentional. And intentionality isn't just thinking about it on Sunday and going, yeah, I think my week's pretty good. That's how I used to live. I used to just kind of think about it and go, I think I can do that. I think I can do it all this week. That's a very different mindset than how do I be most faithful to what matters most right now. If something pops up on your calendar that is important or even urgent, but it's going to take you away from what's more important, you may have to say no. Luke chapter 5, verses 15 through 16 says, but now even more, this is speaking of Jesus, even more the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities. So all these people are pressing in on Jesus, and they have needs. They need to be healed, and Jesus can heal them. I would say that's a pretty good use of Jesus' time. He often did that. He often healed the people that came to him. He often would spend a lot of time with great crowds of people healing them. But in this instance, in Luke 5, it says in verse 16, but he would withdraw to desolate places and pray. There were times that Jesus pulled away from opportunities to heal people, literally heal the sick, in order to pray, because that was more important. Now, if that's true in the life of the Son of God, I would say that's true of you and I as well. And I think this is a principle that we can apply to the things that I have been talking about in this episode. How do I be most faithful to what matters most right now? I may have to say no to something that is very important. I may have to say no to something that is a great opportunity. I might have to say no to something that is gonna come at a cost. It's gonna cost me something. It's gonna cost me a relationship. It's gonna cost me a promotion. It's gonna cost me a thing. I'm not saying always say no to those things. Sometimes you look at your family and you ask them together. You look at your spouse especially, and you ask, is this a sacrifice that we can make together as a family? Those are conversations you can have. But overall, you should always be asking, how do I be most faithful to what matters most right now? When's the last time you pulled away from something that was urgent and even important to do what was most important? When was the last time you said no to something that you know you should have probably said no to in order to prioritize what mattered most? When's the last time you did that? We do our best to fit it all in when the goal for the Christian life was never to be as successful as you possibly can be at everything you can possibly do. I think that in our modern culture especially, we've got too much going on. I do. I was talking with a family recently that was explaining all the extracurricular things that their kids did, and I thought, how in the world are you doing all of that? And I wasn't being judgmental, or I was trying not to be at least, but I'm like, man, we do this to ourselves so often. We say yes to so many things because they're good things. Again, I'm not trying to be judgmental about this. They're good things. And maybe you and your family have decided that you function well in the busyness and the craziness, and you can function better than I can, me and my family can. Listen, every family has a different capacity. I get all that too. But how do I be most faithful to what matters most right now? I'm repeating that question over and over again because I think if you really ask it and you really answer it, it changes a lot. If you measure your success in life by how many things you get knocked off your to-do list, you're going to be dissatisfied. You're going to be burned out. You're going to feel like a failure. But if you measure your success by faithfulness and know that your faithfulness is only because he is faithful to you, you'll rest even when the to-do list is unfinished and long. How do I be most faithful to what matters most right now? This episode has gone longer than I anticipated it going, but I think, again, this is a conversation that I seem to be having a lot, and man, there's a lot more that I could say, but that probably is enough for now. I would challenge you. Get out your calendar, look at the past month. If your calendar is empty, like mine used to be, by the way, meaning you don't schedule anything in your calendar, maybe that's the first thing that needs to change. You need to start actually scheduling your life and sharing that with your spouse or family or whoever it is that you share life with on a daily basis. Maybe it's time to get better organized, because faithfulness will not happen without intentionality. Faithfulness to what matters most will not happen if you're not intentional with it. That's true. That's very true. But get out your calendar, sit down with your spouse, or just sit down with you and the Lord and pray and think and really ask the question and answer the question, how do I be most faithful to what matters most right now? Hopefully, after listening to this episode, that question gets ingrained in your head like it is in mine. And I pray that it's useful to you. I pray that this is something that begins to help you sift through the busyness and the chaos of life. I pray that this is something that helps you to understand what faithfulness really looks like, because it's not just simply checking everything off the to-do list. It's not just simply having a full calendar with a lot of responsibilities. So I hope this is beneficial, and if it has been, share it with somebody that you know. Maybe this is an episode that you come back to, because I think this is something we tend to forget and need to be reminded about. Our culture, in many ways, works the opposite of this. We live very much so in a rat race. We live very much so in a one-up culture, in a social media culture where everybody's comparing themselves to one another and trying to one-up and trying to keep up with everybody else around them, and that's not what we're called to. Don't live your life with that kind of burden. Find rest in Christ. Find rest in the fact that He hasn't called you to do everything. He's called you to rest in Him, and He's called you to be faithful because He is faithful. He's faithful to you. So rest in that. Maybe that's the note that we should end on. Rest in the faithfulness of Christ, and then seek to live in the overflow of that in your heart and your mind. Thanks as always for listening or now watching the podcast as well. I hope that it is a blessing to you. If it is, share it, give us a rating or review wherever it is you listen. Make sure you subscribe and follow to the podcast so you don't follow and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode when it comes out. I try my best to get it out every week, but this week was an example of I did it later in the week because there were other things going on that I needed to be faithful to. And some weeks I don't do it because there are other things going on that I need to be faithful to. So maybe that's another helpful example for you, but I pray that I've given you something that you can hold on to and actually apply to your life. Hope you have a great rest of your week, an intentional rest of your week, and a faithful rest of your week, and God bless.